All right, we're rolling now. Counting us down. 3, 2.
You're listening to Missing Out with Lex Michael and Tari J. Let's start the show.
Hello there, Misketeers. Welcome back to Missing Out. I'm Tari J.
I'm Lex Michael.
And if this is your first time listening, what we do here is we introduce each other to different media, whether it be movies, music, television, spoken word, experiences, things that have built us up as people, and in sharing it, we hope that it builds you up. We're the retrospective that's introspective.
Tari J, you just created a very pretty visual image with all manner of craftsmanship on display in the frame.
Yes, that's how I get my DP on. Hell yeah.
Ew, all right.
I
Ew.
love a good DP.
Ew. All right. We're sorry, folks. This show is canceled now.
No one can stop me.
We're pulling the plug. It's been a great run, and thank you for supporting us. This is the final Missing Out. I am disgusted. I am offended. My childhood has been ruined.
That's what I'm all about. But maybe we will be redeemed.
Save my childhood.
When we introduce our guest for today, Colin P. McDonald.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here.
Colin, who am
you?
I? Who are you? Account for yourself.
That's a good question. I am originally from Ohio. I came out here to California to join the film industry, go to school out here, and kind of just see where I can fit into this interesting, very interesting industry we work in.
And where did you find yourself in the industry? What do you do?
I work for Panavision, so I work with cameras and lenses. I am a product strategist for Panavision, so we do all of our new cameras, our new various different cages and products for other cameras. We do work with some lenses, and obviously the company is all about lenses. My specific job is more cameras and sort of post. I love all things camera and sort of behind the scenes related.
On top of which you are yourself a cinematographer.
Yeah.
A particularly gifted cinematographer, if I may.
Thank you.
I've worked with Colin a number of times, and no, you don't suck at it, sir.
Yeah, I definitely think part of what I realized when I was first working as an AC and as a DP, just totally freelance, it's such an industry and such a business that I was like, I kind of want to keep the artistic value that I find interesting. I want to keep that as a passion and not as a profession. And so I sort of found myself working at Panavision doing, the sort of the tech side. But then on the side, I was able to do projects where I don't have to worry about, okay, am I going to make money from this? Am I going to, have to support whatever from this? It's like I can keep this as a passion. And so I can choose projects that I have interest in and that I think is going to creatively, get the juices going. So that's kind of the direction that I found myself taking.
Nice.
Yeah.
So speaking of things that you have interest in, I think something that everybody is a little bit interested in this week in particular. I don't know if you heard, it's only open in limited release. You may have to drive a little bit out of your way to go see it. But there's a little space movie called Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Now, you may have heard Tari and I talk about it yesterday on Missing Out Monday. We did the better part of an hour, totally spoilery breakdown of our feelings about the movie. But today, what we want to talk about, we want to do something a little bit different. We want to talk about Star Wars, yeah. But we're not going to be talking about Rise of Skywalker today. We're going to be talking about all of Star Wars. Yes, every Star Wars, everything through the prism of its cinematography, right? So, yeah. I guess where we want to start, because I want to talk to you, Colin, about the cinematography of Star Wars, but I also want to talk to you a little bit about your personal journey. That's something that I personally like to do on this show a whole bunch. It's like, okay, let's talk about a thing that you love, but let's also talk about your journey and what part that thing plays in it. So, I guess I want to go back to the beginning. Like, let's start there, right? Let's do your Phantom Menace. Let's do the prequel to your prequel. Where does Star Wars come in for you? A. And B, let's go back even further than that. Where does film come in for you, if you remember? Because for me, I can barely remember a time before movies or Star Wars. But if you can, if there's a point in time that sort of speaks to you that you can go, oh, that if not that, kind of like that moment. Where was that for you that sort of ushered you in this direction?
I mean, I think it was definitely like early elementary school, like second grade, first grade. I was shooting little short films, I had 2 friends that we would write little scripts and we would shoot things. We started shooting just on like high 8 tape. So there was no editing. We just would have to shoot and rewind and re-record over whatever we were shooting, to sort of make the scenes cut together. But I don't really know where the specific point of like why I got into it, but I always loved making little short films. And so I think Star Wars obviously came into play as like, that's the epitome of filmmaking, and specifically because I was always interested in like action adventure kind of movies.
Right.
So that's what my movies were always about is you're following a character and he's, going on an adventure and he's fighting bad guys and he's, just kind of experiencing, the world around him. And so I think Star Wars specifically for me was, I remember watching like VHS copies, specifically Empire. I remember watching, I don't remember if I saw that first or if I just Empire like really stood out to me at my great aunt's house. We would go down there and we would have like the whole family would get together. And so I remember watching Star Wars in the setting of like just family and like just a very familial experience of like we were watching this together and this was sort of the adventure that we're going on in this, and it was always like a trip to get down to my great aunt's house. So it was always a family related thing. So definitely good memories of Star Wars for that sense.
So 2 questions. One, about how old were you?
I would say I was probably 6 or 7.
6 or 7?
Yeah.
Right. Second question. You said you watched them on VHS.
Yes.
Which editions of the VHS copies were they? Because I had about 3 different versions of the original trilogy on VHS.
They were definitely the original trilogy, like the non special edition trilogy.
Did you have the ones where they were all like they were in the kind of slipcase for all 3 of them, and then they were all
it was a
black
box set, yeah,
and Darth Vader's on the first one, Stormtrooper on the second one, Yoda on Jedi, yeah, I had that one as well.
Yeah, so I remember then watching later the special editions, and I don't remember seeing those in the theater, but I remember watching them later and saying like, wait, what is this?
Right,
like, this is a different movie from what I'm watched as a kid. So yeah, definitely remember those VHS box set.
Well, so let's dig into that a little bit because we want to start with the original trilogy. What was it? Do you remember, were there specific images at the time that really grabbed you in particular, right? Because there was always, I feel like, especially when you come to Star Wars very young, the way I did, the way you did, I feel like it's the aesthetics of Star Wars that grab you first, whether it's the designs of the ships or the aliens or the planets or the music, whatever it is. Yeah. So for you, are there images that sort of go back to that place for you, that origin point? Like, was there something that you went, oh, wow, look at that. How can I make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the first time I truly remember Star Wars is Empire. At the very beginning, they're on Hoth. Like, Han Solo is trying to fix the ship before they're heading out. And I remember my cousin saying, like, she didn't realize, we were both, probably 6, 7, 8. And she was like, that's Harrison Ford? Like, she didn't know that was Harrison Ford. And I remember her saying, like, I guess what that implies is that, we were always a family of movies. So we were always seeing different movies. And so, to sort of connect the dots of, who these actors are, who these characters were, you see them in other films. And so we're always talking about how they interact. And so that obviously implies a behind the scenes kind of look into Star Wars. And so it was like, we were talking about the actors as important. And so I think filmmaking for me became that kind of, what's going on behind the scenes. In addition to, just the visuals and the actual story content, the behind the scenes was equally as important for me as the story itself.
Right. And I am so, if you listen to this show, and Tari, I know you don't need to be told, I like movies a lot. Learning about the creative process and the technical process that leads to what you end up seeing on screen, all of that information is like candy to me, especially when it is something like the original Star Wars trilogy, where, and it's truly unfortunate that the original unaltered versions are not more easily accessible, but all of the different types of craftsmanship on display within every frame of the original Star Wars trilogy. You have moving camera shots where you have a miniature of, say, like the Death Star surface, and you also have miniature model ships flying through dogfighting with each other, and they're compositing all of these physical elements into a single frame with camera movement. That's bonkers to me, personally. So let's talk about the first movie, right? Let's break down the original trilogy.
Well, before we jump into specifics, I want to take this moment to drop down the spoiler wall. Let's say that you've never seen
Never seen Star Wars. That's fair.
And there are people who haven't.
Yeah.
So from this point on, I think we will be talking about all aspects of Star Wars. Not necessarily the most recent one. If you want to hear about the most recent one, you can go back to yesterday's episode.
We're definitely not going to be spoiling the new movie.
But we will be talking about all the movies leading up to it. So this is your chance to jump out and come back after you've seen Star Wars, or this is your chance to be like, I'm going to cross the threshold and I'm going to go into this chat fully knowing where I stand. So this is your chance. While you're here, hey, why don't you subscribe? Get this in your feed every Tuesday. Also, if you like what we're doing, why don't you throw us a rating or review? Let us know what you like about it, so that we can keep doing that. And we can share it here on the show. 5-star ratings we read on the show itself. You get a little shout out, which is nice.
And that's how we win. Not by downvoting what we hate, but by upvoting what we love.
Aww, so true.
Very well said.
Smooch. All right, so we're going to dive in right after this message.
Can Harry Potter cast a spell on Black Widow's heart?
Would the Doctor and Niles Crane write a prescription for love?
Do Cthulhu and Godzilla have compatible genitals?
These are the questions you should be ashamed for asking. But if you want answers, listen to Ships in the Night.
It's a fanfic podcast where we put two fictional characters into a relationship.
And figure out what would happen if they bumped uglies.
Ships in the Night. Listen every Tuesday.
But listen quietly.
It's super not safe for work.
All right, we're back, and we were just about to jump into episode 1. Or actually, no.
Episode
first
4,
Star Wars,
yeah.
Episode 4.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The original.
The first movie, which is also the fourth movie, which is also the first movie.
Yes, of course. Totally makes sense.
So, all right. Let's jump into the first movie, because you sent me ahead of this conversation a whole bunch of information that my little reptile pea brain could not process all of the information that you were throwing at me. So I want to talk to you about the tech and the cinematography of the original Star Wars, now of course known as A New Hope. So let's start there. And I guess, where would you, if you're going to let's say indoctrinate somebody into the cinematographic arts using Star Wars, 1977 Star Wars, as your prism, where do you begin? What do you point to first? Is like, this to me as a cinematographer is a pretty stunning example of the craft.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to start chronologically in the release, because technology in Star Wars is hugely important in shaping the way the film industry has changed over the years. Right?
Very much so.
Star Wars is that, whether it's VFX or camera or aesthetics, Star Wars has shaped our industry. So I think that's a huge, important part to start with. So A New Hope, I think the element that really stands out to me is when they're on Tatooine, and when Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen have just died, and that shot of their dead bodies really stands out as just an incredible cinematic shot. And that's like, in history, that is the shot that kind of defines Star Wars in a little bit, because
how
it's
so?
like there's you're seeing like the war element, right? It's like there's your war and death and like emotion, and then he's left, standing there, by himself, and so it's like he has to go on this journey, and so I think that in one shot that kind of sums up all of Star Wars. But it's just a beautiful shot of him, on sort of the far left of frame, and then there on the right, and you just see this like open expanse, which is Tatooine, which is kind of also reminiscent of space. It's just this open expanse.
Sea,
and so
it's like how space is a sea of stars, it's a sea of sand.
Yeah, exactly. Which, yeah, and they say that there's more stars in our galaxy than there are grains of sand on Earth.
But are there more stars in our galaxy than there are grains of sand on Tatooine?
That is a good question.
And which has more grains of sand, Tatooine or Jakku? These are the important questions.
I would say Tatooine.
I don't care.
We need to. If you have an in with the Lucasfilm Story Group and one of them can tell us which planet has more sand, please tweet at us.
We would like to know.
But yeah, like I like what you're talking about, how like the single image can tell a story within itself, right?
Yeah.
And you have Luke on Tatooine now alone, not just feeling alone, but literally being alone, having lost his aunt and uncle, his only family, and standing in that open expanse, and how that shot really enables you to assume his feeling, his perspective. Mm-hmm. I'm also a really big fan in that scene of when it cuts into the skeletons. And I don't know if it's Owen or Beru, but the one that's like bent over backwards, like, it's great. My favorite character in Star Wars is that skeleton.
Yeah.
It's a shame we didn't see
that
that skeleton
have a
work
name,
more,
does it? We just talked about all the names, that no one's named that that prop.
It's a good point. Like, where's the expanded universe? Like, I get that it's either Luke's aunt or uncle, but where's the expanded universe story where it's like either Owen or Beru is like the new Terminator in Dark Fate, where like his inside skeleton can step outside of him and operate independently? It's like that, and the skeleton's name is, I don't know, Dave or something.
Okay, all right.
Dave Spacebones.
I thought this was gonna go like, where's the expanded universe story where they're doing an autopsy and discover which one was which, and we really get into the science of like more studies in Star Wars. But you're like, nah, bruh. That skeleton is its own thing, and Aunt Beru is running around doing her own thing. She escaped the Empire and was like, fuck my nephew.
That's true. Like, Aunt Beru is still out there, and she left her skeleton behind to fool the authorities.
I like that sort of shows, just the two of you, shows like the two definitions of a Star Wars fan, like you can take it like different ways, like a little more like you're like, no, it's like it has to be about like precise, like history, and then you can also just say, these are stories, and we can just take it however we want.
I'm just thinking, how do we generate a 500-issue comic book series out of the skeleton? And so I'm just trying to spin story. All right,
that's a great idea.
But so, would you say, like, when you were younger, would you say you felt particularly impacted by that particular moment in that way? And
not in that way. I don't think when I was younger I
thinking about the skeleton operating independently?
I just had this, visceral sense of like, wow, this is impactful.
Right.
And it's like, this has meaning to me. But I couldn't verbalize it, at the time.
So, all right, so take us to the next.
So I think this is also a good example. This shot in particular is a good example of what Gilbert Taylor is the name of the DP that shot the original Star Wars movie.
DP is director of photography, if you're listening and you don't know.
Cinematographer. Yeah. DOP if you're British.
The one who takes the pictures that move.
That's right. Yeah. So Gilbert Taylor is actually not George Lucas's first choice.
Okay.
He wanted another guy by the name of Jeffrey Owensworth, who is a cinematographer that shot 2001: A Space Odyssey. George Lucas, I guess, wanted more of a documentary kind of feel to Star Wars, which is not at all like what we really think of it as. We think of Star Wars as this like classic Hollywood, like with the John Williams score. It's very, I wouldn't say clean cut, but it's very like utilitarian kind of shots, and it's very classic Hollywood lighting. Like big lights, shadows, and this is what Gilbert Taylor brought to Star Wars. I think that apparently Gilbert Taylor came in because Jeffrey Unsworth was not available at the time. So Gilbert Taylor shot things like Dr. Strangelove and A Hard Day's Night. So there were elements where George Lucas said, okay, if I can't have my first choice, Gilbert Taylor may be able to bring those elements to the film.
Get me the guy who shot the Beatles running around.
That's right. Yeah, it was very documentarian.
Yeah.
Right. So I think George was like, okay, this is a good, safe choice. But it turns out that Gilbert Taylor had very specific beliefs in how he felt this film should be shot, and I think there's like there's a sort of a story where George says, oh, let's move this light over here, or put the camera down low and let's get this big shot. And Gilbert Taylor says, listen, kid, like let me tell you how this is supposed to run. And George Lucas is sort of like, oh, like, okay.
Do you think that was the last time anyone said "listen, kid" to
Yeah.
George Lucas?
Yeah. I think so, yes.
Like, if you tried that shit now, he'd go to his phone, tap a couple buttons, you'd be like, what's going on, Mr. Lucas? He'd be like, I just bought you.
That's right. That's right. So, George, definitely you guys have seen THX 1138.
A long time ago, but yeah, it's
very
it's
art
wild.
house kind of film.
Yeah.
Very different feel. And I think, the fact that Gilbert Taylor sort of made this the style definitely positioned Star Wars into the way that it currently is. And it wasn't for, his choices. Star Wars would look very different, and we can debate whether that's good or bad.
Right.
Yeah. The way you describe it makes me think of Starship Troopers, how that kind of has a documentary feel to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, would Star Wars have been as famous as it is today if there's so many factors that go into it, and I think that shows that the reason Star Wars did so well, I believe, is because there were so many voices saying, no, this is how this element should be, this is how this element should be. And so I think, which we'll get into the prequels later, where George had total control. The original trilogy is made up of so many different voices.
Yes.
And I think that's why it was such a success.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you talk about how the DP that they ultimately went with was not the first choice, right? Like, they ended up with what they ended up with because of essentially a limitation that they had to work around.
Yeah.
And that, in large part, is the story of the making of Star Wars. It's George Lucas had all of these big, crazy, ephemeral, ethereal, mythological ideas, and trying to get it into the type of shape that would actually be digestible in a 2-hour movie required him to sacrifice quite a bit, compromise quite a bit of other things. And then you had a lot of people like Marsha Lucas's wife, for example, going into the edit and being like, okay, tweak that, move this around, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't get the movie that we get without this big series of tweaks and compromises, which is sort of fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating commentary on how film is made in general, right? Like, and I do think Lucas, and it's definitely true when you arrive at the prequels, Lucas is thought of the way we think of auteurs in large part, right? But I think Star Wars in particular sort of proves the lie in the auteur theory, right? Because even though it's very much George Lucas's baby, George Lucas alone, left to his own devices, that movie would not look anything like the movie that we know and love.
Yeah.
So take us to the next big moment for you in the movie.
Well, I think part of what has fascinated me is then, diving deeper into the specifics. So A New Hope was actually shot on Panavision Panaflex cameras.
Okay.
With C-series lenses, which are like from the 70s. They're very warm, very, today we would call them very vintage lenses, but there's a lot of things that lenses can do, certainly in that time frame, where there are elements and coatings on lenses that that actually we are illegal to do today. So there are certain things that
Wait, you can't slide past that. Wait,
Yeah.
explain that to me.
yeah. So back in the day, you could use certain elements like lead, or you could use certain things that are illegal today to use. And so Panavision, one of the great things that we do have is these legacy optics that are lenses that have certain looks to them that we can't duplicate today. And so I can talk later when we get to The Force Awakens and other movies where they had to look back at these old lenses to recreate some of these aesthetics from the original trilogy. And then the other thing I want to mention is also the film stock that they used. On A New Hope, they used what's called 100T 5247 is the type of film emulsion that they used. And so Kodak, these are all Kodak film stocks. And just like, cameras get better and better, there was HD and then 2K and then 8K now. Film stocks had a similar, although that has to do with resolution. They also have increments in technology where they get better. They can see into blacks better. They can see more of the highlights. So there is advances in the film technology, and so this has changed through the Star Wars. Over 40 years, this has also changed. The quality of a film shot, in the 70s versus, today, even if it's shot on film.
You were just talking about advancements in picture resolution, right? So are you able to explain to somebody like me who understands this stuff but doesn't totally understand this stuff, what is the difference between, say, 2K, 4K, 8K, other than the more Ks you have, it looks prettier? Why is that?
Why is that?
Why
Well,
is it that the more
reason-
Ks you have, the prettier it looks?
Yeah, a lot of times people talk about the number of Ks being the sharper the image is going to look. In fact, that's actually sort of the opposite, because if you think about if you just have 4 pixels, so a K represents how many pixels is in an image. And pixels are sort of the squares that make up the image. So your screen is made up a bunch of squares that light up, and they're red, green, or blue, and they affect the color that you're seeing. And so when you have 1,000 across, they're so small that you can't see individuals, but that's what makes up your picture. And so the more pixels you have, there is actually your eye is able to see, say HD, you can kind of see each pixel in the sense that images are going to look blocky.
Okay.
And so blocky is sometimes confused with sharpness. So if an image is more blocky, it looks sharper. And so in HD, compared to SD, your images were looking sharper in the sense that you were seeing blocks. When you get to something like 8K, these pixels are so small that they actually make the image look more round. So if you think about just 4 pixels, you can see it's a square. And if you have a circle that's made up of pixels where you can see each square, your square isn't going to really look like a square, right? It's going to look like a jagged circle.
Okay.
Did I say square? I meant to say
circle. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you think about a circle in a lower resolution scenario, the circle is going to look like a jagged circle because you're going to see the circles made up of squares.
Right.
All right.
Yeah. So it's basically like the difference between building something with cubics versus Legos.
Yeah.
In the way that, like, if you're building something large scale with Legos, the larger it is, the more of a like round cohesive thing it's going to appear to be. Where if you're building it with cubics, you can see the individual bricks, and the item itself won't be as like round, or it'll just be like a lot of sharp edges because everything is built from individual squares.
Correct, yeah. So that as you get higher resolutions, those squares are so small that you no longer notice those sort of stair steps as you go around the circle. You're just seeing a circle. So, in fact, higher resolutions are going to provide softer images than a lower resolution would.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a bunch of mushrooms, and you're going to tell me all of that again with special emphasis on circles made of squares.
Okay.
No. Just listen to this podcast again. So you were talking about the film getting better over time. So was it just what the film was made out of, or was it in the way that they processed it that improved it from generation to generation?
Well, it's definitely both.
Okay.
I was specifically talking about sort of the film itself, the chemistry that makes up the celluloid. Improves. I don't know that I could talk specifically about the chemistry of celluloid, but yes, it improves. It has improved over time.
Okay.
Just like I say, just like digital technology is improving, film stock is certainly improving, and that's why I think that Force Awakens was shot on film, but a lot of times it looks so clean and crisp, it almost looks like it was shot digitally. And I think then there are some people that say, well, then what's the point of shooting film versus digital if eventually it's all going to look the same?
So you could say you did.
Yeah, it is.
For the
it's
cred.
a genuine, a question that people have is like some people say, there's no point in shooting film because we can make it look identical. But other people say, no, there is a nostalgic element to shooting on film.
Right.
Yeah. There's also like a texture to it, right? When you're shooting on film, there's a very specific grain that you it's almost imperceptible, but like you can feel it in terms
and
of
so older stocks would have more of that grain. So the original trilogy is going to have much more grain than the sequel trilogy, and that's why the sequel trilogy looks so much cleaner. But a lot of digital shows now actually put grain on the digital content, so they're trying to emulate that.
Trying to lie to
that
us.
look. Yeah.
They're dressing up in false clothes.
Yeah. Well, they know that's how you get that sense of warmth. It's what we grew up on. We like that grain. We're like, yeah, that's what makes it feel good.
It's like that's how I know it's art, and this is in fact good for me.
Yeah.
So, what were there vast improvements between Episode 4 and when we get to Empire Strikes Back? Like in terms of, I know that Empire Strikes Back is people will say it's quote unquote better shot just because they're doing a lot more experimental stuff. So like what would you say was the impetus for that transition?
It was actually shot on the same film stock and actually the same camera, the Panavision Panaflex, and C-series lenses. So it was identical in terms of specifics.
Okay.
But obviously, so in episode 5, Peter, I'm going to say this name wrong, but Shasinski.
I believe it.
Yeah, you nailed
it. Shot Empire Strikes Back. He did things like Rocky Horror Picture Show, and has his own aesthetic. So I think he brought a look and an eye to the film to make it its own look. And I think personally, actually Empire is one of my favorite in terms of cinematography.
Yeah. Well, it also benefits from having some of the best design work in any of these movies as well.
Yeah, and actually, so the production designer of that movie was Norman Reynolds.
Okay.
And actually, I want to jump back to A New Hope briefly.
Okay.
There was one other thing that Gilbert Taylor did in A New Hope, where when they were on the Death Star, a lot of that set was just gray walls. And so he actually would cut out sections of the walls and install a light in the wall. And so the scene was lit almost with what we call practicals, or lights that are within the scene that help light the scene. So he kind of added to that aesthetic as well, and I think developed kind of the in terms of production design, he helped establish that aesthetic as well as the production designer. So I think the combination of a production designer and DP it's extremely important.
Absolutely.
Their partnership is what defines how a film looks. And as a cinematographer, my own perspective is like, when I go shoot something, I have to have somebody that I trust and that I like doing production design. And that's like one of the first things I would ask is, who's the production designer? Who am I working with that's going to be doing set design, or, depending on the level of production, asking who is this person that's going to support me on the production design side.
Right. Well, because you have to work in conjunction with each other to create the image, right? And you talk about both of these things are crucial to the look of the movie, which of course, by extension, is utterly crucial to how the movie is making you feel.
Yeah.
Moment to moment. So, okay, so I guess I want to talk about Empire a little bit more, in large part because, a lot of people say very aggressively that Empire Strikes Back is sort of the pinnacle, the platonic ideal of what Star Wars can be. I guess, first of all, where do you come down on, like, do you have a personal ranking? Like, do you put Empire up on the same pedestal that basically everybody else does?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Empire is number one on my list for pretty much
I like it also.
any list that you're.
But you talked about, like, as part of your secret origin, you talked about Empire most specifically speaking to you from a very, very young age. So I guess what was it about Empire in particular, as opposed to, say, the first movie or Return of the Jedi?
Well, I mean, I guess it wasn't my first introduction. I mean, I assume I watched A New Hope first, but that cinematography, them on Hoth, just stands out as, like, just ingrained in my brain as, like, this is Star Wars.
Right.
And some of that, in terms of cinematography, I know that, shooting a white background and characters on a white background is always kind of like a no-no, because it's like, you're going to overexpose and it's hard to get the dynamic range. Dynamic range is sort of your white to your black, that sort of that range of grays in between. That's always sort of a challenge. And so shooting in Norway, where they shot during like the biggest snowstorm in, like, Norway's history, they shot Empire. And so there's actually a great story of, like, the crew was inside the hotel. Irvin Kershner, who directed this, told this story, that the crew was all inside the hotel, and they made Mark Hamill go out into the snow, and he had to, like, they were literally shooting outside the hotel's door, and Mark Hamill goes out, and he has to, like, crawl through. This is after I'm not sure if it's before or after he's been attacked by the
Wampa.
The Wampa, yeah. But he's outside, and the rest of the crew is nice and toasty in the hotel.
Poor Mark.
But yeah, shooting in that kind of environment was kind of a no-no in terms of cinematography, and so that scene and that choice is pushing boundaries of cinematography.
Well, so how do you execute something like that? How do you work around all of the potential obstacles that lead people to say this is something you should not do, if at all possible?
I think it's just part of it is just sheer, like, we're just gonna do it. They're just like, we're gonna make it work. And to also have something that people hadn't seen before, or I think the just pushing the boundaries of the technology, and then helping, the technology grow. I don't know if in this scenario, I don't know if, Kodak did anything specific, or if that helped them, evaluate, new stocks of film. But I think, anytime a production does something that's unique, everybody else is kind of watching.
So you've also been talking a little bit about the not just the way that the technology has developed, but the way that across the original trilogy there was a lot of continuation of technology from one movie to the next, and like you were just talking about, finding new ways to take the same technology and push it further, right? So by the time we get to Return of the Jedi, right, like, do you feel like you see the same thing happening there, or do you feel it's more of a lateral move?
Yeah, well, in Jedi, they did use a different film stock, so they did start to, now a lot of film stocks, it can be a choice. So you might use an older film stock because you want, that effect. So I don't know in this scenario, there's specific choices on film stock, but just like lenses, film stocks could be, a aesthetic choice. So, in Jedi, they used 5293 film stock. I don't know if that was because, it's a newer film stock and so they want it to be cleaner, or if, there was an aesthetic choice. In this case, it's also a new DP. In the original trilogy, each one was a new DP. So in Return of the Jedi, a guy named Alan Hume, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right either, but he came
Yeah, I'll
along.
buy it. Yeah. That sounds right
I
to
hope
me.
so. Yeah,
Feels good.
He came along with director Richard Marquand.
Yes.
And so what I thought I heard was the story with Richard Marquand was that the fact that George Lucas had done the Star Wars, classic Star Wars crawl, and not done traditionally you would have title cards at the beginning of a movie, and it would say, who the cinematographer was, the director, editor, all these title cards. George Lucas chose not to do that, and in the original movie, it was sort of a surprise. They kind of like the MPAA, who's kind of in control, and also the Directors Guild of America. They kind of let that slide because it's like, oh, that's our tradition, this is how you operate, and it was sort of random, and so they let that slide. In Empire Strikes Back, when he did it again, he actually got fined by these organizations because he didn't have those names at the beginning of the movie.
And didn't they try and argue at one point that because his name is essentially the name of the company, Lucasfilm, having that at the front of the movie in a way counts as crediting himself up front and nobody else? I believe that was part of their argument.
I haven't heard that one. Yeah,
I want to say that could be totally apocryphal. That could be nonsense. But I recall reading that somewhere, and that this argument was sort of what led Lucas to leave the DGA, no?
Yeah, I think, this argument, is absolutely what had Lucas leave the DGA. And then what he then couldn't do is get a director to fill in to direct episode 6. He couldn't get someone because the DGA wouldn't allow him to. So he went to sort of an unknown, relatively unknown director, which was Richard Marquand, and then Richard had his DP come along with him, and so this happens a lot. We'll talk about Rian Johnson and Steve Yedlin. They're sort of together as a team, and they've worked on movies together. So this was the same situation where they had director DP came together, but also like the Star Wars prequels, there was some conflict, right? And so it sounds like George Lucas really stepped in and essentially directed a lot of Return of the Jedi.
That's the vibe that I get. Yeah, it's like in interviews and stuff that I've seen, nobody wants to say that George Lucas shadow directed the whole movie, but everybody is willing to say George was on set a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, that people say, oh, well, they have all these problems with the sequel trilogy and with Solo and with Rogue One and all these things. But it's like it happened in the original trilogy too, Right. They had these same kind of issues. Mm-hmm. So in fact, the story goes, or at least I've heard, is that Alan Hume didn't like what was happening, and he actually left the project. And so there's another DP that came on named Alec Mills. And so Alec Mills did a lot of, like, he did the speeder chase scene on Endor. And so he did a lot of the really cool stuff that Jedi is known for.
What was do you know what the conflict was that led
I don't.
the guy to
Yeah,
leave?
I don't.
She's just like, these little bears are dumb.
Yeah, that's
I am too classy
no.
for
I
this.
think it had to do with the fact that, at least what I've sort of read in a couple different sites on the internet, who knows, but from what I've read, it sounded like because George was coming in and saying to Richard Marquand, like, this is how we're going to do things. It was more of like politics that sort of
that. So maybe he felt like
Yeah.
Lucas was stepping in to such a
Yeah.
degree that they couldn't
Yeah.
do the job they wanted to
Yeah.
do. That makes sense. So Return of the Jedi has easily some of my favorite shots of the ships in any Star Wars movie. And I referenced earlier in this conversation how odd I am, especially in the original versions before they mask a lot of this stuff with CG, when you're actually looking at the tangible models that instinctually you could reach out and touch. They're small, but you could reach out and touch them. There's a shot in Return of the Jedi, and it's of the Falcon, I think maybe Wedge's X-Wing, and a couple of TIE fighters chasing him. And it's the shot that sort of starts, they fly into the frame, and you travel with the ships down into the tunnel, into the body of the Death Star. And that shot is honestly like one of the most magical things that I've ever seen in any movie whatsoever. Like I play that, I want a GIF of it that I could frame and just play on repeat on my wall all the time and stuff. Do you have moments like that specifically that sort of speak to you in that really direct, magical way from the original trilogy? And follow-up question, how do you feel about the special edition changes in that regard as well? Because a lot of those shots, a lot of those original elements were replaced with computer-generated imagery for the new releases and the versions that are now most commonly available.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the special editions is definitely like a separate conversation of like, how, I mean, to me, I kind of do understand George Lucas's view of like, this is how I imagined it in my head, and he wasn't able to do the things that he wanted to do. And that goes back to your concept of an auteur. He wasn't able to control everything that he wanted to. And in that respect, I understand why you want to go back and you want to make it how, you planned for it to be. But then it's like a lot of other people's work went into actually crafting how it was. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think maybe there's kind of a disconnect of like, well, this is how George wanted it, but it's like, this is how it turned out. And this is what people were able to achieve. And so in that respect, I think having the, original non-special edition, is really powerful because it's like, this is what was made.
Right. So is there a particular moment, like what is if you had to pick one, is there a standout moment from the original trilogy, any of the first three films, where if somebody were to ask you sort of arbitrarily, out of nowhere, apropos of nothing, hey, what is it about these movies that speaks to you through this prism, right? What is it about these movies that inspires you? Can you point to something that really makes you go, oh yeah, that I want to be able to do this? Like, is there one scene, one sequence, one set of shots, or even one shot?
What affected me as a filmmaker? Or?
Something that really just feels like you got a real personal connection to that moment. Like something that just every time you see it, because whether it's shot composition or the way the elements are interacting with each other in the space, that just continues to this day to just make your heart sing.
Mine is the teddy bear picnic at the end of Jedi. That's mine. And then when
Bear picnic.
yeah. And then we like pan over and see a redeemed Darth Vader, and you're like, "Who's that old guy?" Yeah,
I like that.
that's mine.
I like the shots of the ghosts because I can see through them.
Yeah, and then when he turns into Hayden Christensen, and you're like, "Who's that guy?"
I don't know. I mean, yeah, that's
Colin's
the one
just
thing
like,
that
all
I
right,
definitely don't like.
He just jumped out of the boat, and I guess I'm gonna try and grab the oar and row to the shore now.
For the most part, I don't have a problem with the special editions, but the one thing that I really do not like is that they put Hayden Christensen in there, because it's like he should be the old version of Darth Vader. Like, that's chronologically that makes sense. So it's that's just fan service, or just like, that's just ridiculous.
Well, that's just
that part I don't.
Let's try and
like
corral
at all.
everything into one perfectly neat straight line, if possible, in a way that I feel sort of is self-defeating. The way I feel like a lot of the special edition changes are a little bit self-defeating, and as you pointed out earlier, it's other people's work that's being altered, and even more oddly, the original Star Wars won, I want to say something like 7 Academy Awards in technical categories. Those things that won Academy Awards are all of the elements that he went back and changed, and I find that baffling, but you know what? That's his prerogative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to jump into the prequels a little bit, because there was a long gap between when the last episode 6 aired, and there were a few years where we were getting re-releases with a bunch of different things added, but the technology had changed so much between the Last Jedi and when we got the Phantom Menace in 1999. So and I also feel like we got a lot of a transition to more digital photography, a lot of CG and things of that sort. So like, what was that transition like?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely, it's well known that George Lucas wanted to wait until he had the ability to do the things that in the original trilogy he couldn't do, hence the special edition. So he was waiting until the technology, digital technology and also CGI, was at a point where he could feel like he could do what he truly imagined.
When I can put Jabba the Hutt in the first movie, I know I'm ready to make the next movie.
That's right. That's right. So some of those technologies was the advents of digital cameras, right? So Phantom Menace was a mixture of film and digital. Mostly film. They actually used a Arriflex 435 camera and a Sony HDC 750, which is very early. I don't think there was too much of the film shot in that. It was mostly film and newer film stocks, like we just talked about. So the DP of actually all three of the prequels was David Tattersall, who George Lucas knew from actually the Young Indiana Jones.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, so I think this also, like we talked about, George had so many different voices in the originals. He really wanted to sort of bring in his crew and say, okay, these are my core crew people, these are who I trust, and these are who I can make sure are sort of going in the direction that I want to go. So I think that is why, the prequels have a feeling of the Artur, like, this is his baby, and, it wasn't really diverging from that. And I think that's why, in some respects, kind of hurt the trilogy, because there weren't other voices saying, well, let's do this, let's try this.
Maybe needed someone to give notes. There's that very famous / infamous documentary from the original Phantom Menace DVD release. I'm sure you can find it online, but a lot of scenes, all fly on the wall stuff, and so many little bits of Lucas talking and kind of walking everybody in the room through what he intends to do, and everybody in the room not saying anything, but looking like they really wonder if they oughta.
Yeah. And in terms of some specifics, this was the first one. Phantom Menace was actually shot on Hawk C-Series, so this is not Panavision glass, but it's a company called Hawk, and so they are very similar. Their C-Series is 70s, also older glass that has similar kind of warm characteristics that the Panavision C-Series would have had as well.
Are you? Can you?
So they're
elaborate on that a little bit.
They're fairly matching in terms of lens quality.
Okay.
Again, this only works and applies to the fact that they were shooting film. What gets really interesting is when we get to Attack of the Clones, they switched over entirely to Sony Cinealti f900 cameras.
Okay.
Which really is like the first kind of modern cinema grade digital camera. And the Cinealta line that Sony came out with is actually still alive today. The Sony Venice camera, which I think the biggest film recently would be the new Top Gun movie.
It's Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah, was shot Sony Venice. So that's kind of their iteration of the same camera. Obviously, it's progressed, it's changed a lot, but it's sort of the same line that Sony has.
And wasn't, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but wasn't Attack of the Clones maybe the first movie, certainly of that kind, of that stature and scale, shot entirely in digital?
Yeah, I believe it was, yeah. And which means, in terms of lenses, Panavision actually stepped back in, and we created lenses specifically for digital. This was the first time we had ever done this. There's some engineering changes that have to be made for digital lenses that have to do with basically how far the camera sensor is versus the glass of the lens. Mm-hmm. So we were able to engineer some specific lenses for Attack of the Clones, which then sort of helped continue a very famous line of lenses called the Panavision Primos. And so this group of lenses is very well known as a digital, specifically digital lens.
So what is the process essentially of developing a new type of lens for digital versus film, and how in your perception does that change account for what some consider to be the jarring aesthetic differences between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones?
I think that's really to do with the camera in this scenario. On a film camera, they shoot 35, right? 35 is the size of the film celluloid, and right now there's a big push into large format optics, which is actually even larger sensor size or size of the celluloid than 35. So as you increase the size of the sensor, you get different magnification and different depth of field. And so magnification and depth of field is sort of very much an effect that the viewer may not notice, but is going to look very different. And so on the f900s, it's a much smaller size sensor. So it's going to be shallower depth of field, which means you're going to have less. The focus is going to look like you can see more into the scene. Mm-hmm. You can see the foreground and background in focus, kind of an effect. Whereas large format is the opposite, where it's extremely out of focus in the background and only the subject in the foreground is in focus. I'm kind of dumbing it down, but that would be your depth of field change, and your magnification change would be how much of the background you can see. So there's a difference between field of view and magnification. Field of view is more of like, how, if you're a wide, medium, or close. But magnification has to do with how much of the background is able to be seen behind the subject. So you could have, let's say you have a medium shot that's sort of person's waist to the top of their head. Field of view would be the same if you're on these different size sensors or film size, but you may see more in the background or less in the background depending on the size of the sensor. So the fact that the f900 is a very small sensor due to the technology of the time, it's going to have, like I say, less depth of field and a smaller magnification effect than film would have. So I think that's where the subtle change would be seen in The Phantom Menace versus Attack of the Clones.
Okay. And so between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, obviously a couple years have elapsed. Obviously, we've continued to refine the technology. Do you feel, because I feel as an audience member that even though Revenge of the Sith very clearly also shot digitally, feels a little bit more settled visually and developed visually than Attack of the Clones does. Is there a particular factor that you feel accounts for that?
Well, I believe those two were shot on the same camera and same lenses, so I think that would be like the CGI element,
Right.
Of they're getting better at the CGI element, and so that could be why you're seeing more of a more solidified look of Revenge of the Sith, because they've had more time to refine that aspect of it.
That makes sense. So you've talked a lot about the technical processes that inform the aesthetics of both the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. When you were first discovering the prequels, when you got through that trilogy, very broadly, how did you feel about the result, the end result, versus the end result of those processes in the original trilogy?
I mean, when I first saw the prequel trilogy, I think obviously I didn't know anything about digital cameras or like what is the difference between film and digital and
Right.
and CGI. I mean, obviously, you notice that this does look a little different, but I think at the time, it's just like, this is the future. This is kind of how things are changing, and so you don't really think of it as. I didn't think of it as a bad thing. I didn't think of it as like, this is oh no, what's happening to cinema. I just thought,
Right. You weren't like, they ruined my childhood.
Yeah, this is the future, and I Star Wars means so much to me, really not because of the cinematography and the filmmaking side. I mean, Star Wars ultimately I think I fell in love with because of the story and where it takes you. And so that's why I do I read some of the Star Wars books, and
Right.
I read I am more into the story side of it as Star Wars. Now I've learned so much from the behind the scenes stuff that
Right.
then has affected my interests and my understanding of the film industry.
Right.
So I use that as a tool to help me in my professional life, but Star Wars is really, to me, about the story and where it takes you and the feeling that you get from exploring these planets and these storylines and these characters.
Well, so speaking of story and where it takes you, now after the prequels come out, we're in a window of time where there's no Star Wars for about a decade. But in that window, your story takes you pretty decisively in the direction of film and cinematography in particular. So before we get to the present and the sequel trilogy, I guess in this window, what was that part of that journey like for you? What was there a moment? Was there a time? What was the point of entry to, okay, I'm gonna pick up a camera and do this professionally?
Well, I mean, it started before Star Wars for me. I mean, not before. Before I had seen Star Wars, I was making little short films.
Right.
So, I think Star Wars has helped then, define things like learning about digital photography and learning about aspect ratios. I remember when I first bought the DVD version of both the original trilogy and then the prequel trilogy, I remember distinctly learning that I wanted to get the widescreen version versus the full screen version. And so I think that was one of the first very technical things that I learned was well, what is the difference? Why is it important to see the full image? And so I think that out of all learning about photography, that was one of the first things that I learned specifics about filmmaking.
Right.
Was through Star Wars.
So that brings us to near the present on our timeline, right? So now you're working at Panavision, you're doing this stuff professionally, and the sequel trilogy starts to come out. So you, as a lifelong Star Wars fan who is now working directly and frequently with the technology that enables us to see these moving pictures, what struck you about the aesthetics of Force Awakens when you saw it, and what do you feel is most striking to you about the general aesthetics of the sequel trilogy films overall?
Well, having then gone to film school and understanding how digital is different from film, and how, starting to see the aesthetics of the original trilogy and the grain that we talked about, and the CGI elements that when I was younger, I was like, I don't care, it's cool, it's fun.
Right.
Now I start to understand this stuff. And to be honest, I thought The Force Awakens was too clean and was a different aesthetic than the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. They did try, so they did shoot film. They shot Panavision Millennium XL2 film cameras with the same lenses, actually, some of the exact same lenses that the original trilogy shot.
I remember you were telling me, I think, when we got together recently, and you were telling me about that in particular, and you were talking to me about specific lenses that were chosen for specific sequences based on how those lenses were utilized in the original movie.
Yeah, I believe that Dan Mindell is the name of the cinematographer that shot The Force Awakens, and he also shot Rise of Skywalker. He did want to have specific choices of saying, this lens will be used for the good guys, and this lens will, or not a specific lens, but a series of lenses will be used, the C-series lenses versus the Primo anamorphics, which are much more of like a cleaner looking anamorphic lens. Would be used for the bad guys. So the lens choice would help give an aesthetic to a certain character. And so I think that is the type of filmmaking that I really enjoy and want to emulate, is using cinematography to really help tell the story.
Right.
And I think Dan Mindell has definitely got an eye for that, and wants to try to achieve those effects.
Okay, so then if you, because we're gonna bring this in for a landing pretty soon because we're running out of movies. Actually, you know what? I guess sidebar, since there are non-saga Star Wars films, do you have any particular thoughts about the general aesthetics of either Rogue One or Solo?
Yeah, I think that Rogue One is the film that is like, that is what Star Wars should look like to me.
Yeah.
That was shot digitally, was shot on Alexa 65 and Panavision Ultra Panatars, which are the Ultra Panatars is a really cool story, actually, of Quentin Tarantino that came into Panavision, and he saw these lenses which were from the 50s, from like the Ben-Hur, they shot Ben-Hur,
yeah.
And they were actually in a case, just like here's history of our lenses. And Quentin Tarantino and his DP came in and said, "Can we shoot on those?" And we're like, "Sure." And
They're like, how much lead do you want to be exposed to?
yeah, exactly. That's what we said. And so, we got Panavision got them ready, and so they shot Hateful Eight on those lenses.
Nice.
Very nice. And then I think it was directly from Hateful Eight, then they went to Rogue One. And so, having this sort of these older lenses.
So wait, you're saying it's not just the same type of lens, but literally the same lenses shot both movies?
Yeah, there's only a few of those, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's the type of stuff I'm talking about. That I just like, give me a bag of that and let me sit on the couch and eat it.
Yeah. Well, the older lenses, there's not necessarily that many sets, so they have to shoot literally the same lenses because there's not that
It makes
many.
it because right, like even Quentin Tarantino, like who's he gonna turn to be like, make me an old lens with a ton of lead in it?
Yeah.
I'd be like, no.
Yeah.
Why would you ask us that? I agree. I'm a big fan of the general aesthetic of Rogue One, and it does capture. It captures an energy that almost feels to me not even necessarily of the original movie, but more of the feeling I got playing around in the expanded universe. Something
Yeah.
about the aesthetic and the general look of that movie evokes that feeling. Really
Yeah, it's not just the cinematography. Just like we talked about, the production design is, again, as a cinematographer, like if I don't have a good production design, then it's like I don't have something good to shoot. Even if my lighting is perfect and it's, my eye is incredible, it's like if I don't have something physically there to shoot, then it's like you can't make good pictures. So the two are so important, and I think Rogue One had both Greg Fraser, who shot Rogue One, and the production design on that movie is like precisely what Star Wars should look like, and I think they just achieved that to a T. And in fact, Greg Fraser is also the one that established the look of The Mandalorian as well. So they brought him back to do The Mandalorian, and he did a couple episodes, and then I think another guy named Baz. I'm gonna say this name wrong again too, but Iden. He shot the rest of Mandalorian. So those two stories are similar looks, and you can tell. And I think that to me is what Star Wars really should look like.
Nice.
Okay, and how does that compare to now where we've finally caught up to Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi? For me, like, say what you will, story-wise, I still feel like it's a very colorful, vibrant movie.
Yeah, I think so. That was Rian Johnson and Steve Yedlin shot that movie. I think that the two of them are like best buds kind of thing, and they work together really closely. And I think they did a great job of achieving the look of The Force Awakens. So I think they did a good job of like emulating that look, which I think has a different look to it than the original trilogy or the prequel trilogy. It's its own style, which is good. That they're giving it their own look, but like I said, I think Rogue One really nails to me the look that Star Wars should have.
All right.
Okay.
And Solo, I think Solo is another one shot by Bradford Young. It's also was shot digitally, Alexa 65, with Arri lenses. To me, the lenses are less. They have less character in that one. I think that's more about his lighting choices. Bradford Young is all about practicals and just like using you again. This is again going back to the production designer. It's like they set the scene, they have the lights in the scene, and that's it. You're not putting in big movie lights. You're using what's in the scene and you're shooting that.
Right.
And so that can be a really powerful effect. Which actually goes back to Gilbert Taylor in the original one, where he was putting the lenses in the scene,
The walls,
and
yeah.
so it's like that's I think that that aesthetic is carried through then to the newer films, which is very cool.
I like
and
that.
and actually is a very popular thing just in cinema right now is to use practicals. It's less Roger Deakins does this a lot, is like just using what's in the scene. You're not adding all these movie lights, and so that can have like a very subtle, very realistic look to it, which maybe also goes back to George's idea of a documentary style. So maybe the documentary style is achieved not through the use of like handheld camera or something that you think of documentaries, but maybe it's the lighting that helps achieve that look. So I don't know. I just thought of this, but it's sort of like he is getting kind of the aesthetic that he wanted.
I really appreciate how you brought that entire thing full circle. One of the strongest arguments I have ever heard for cinematographer as storyteller. You brought us all the way back. You tied a nice, beautiful little bow on it, and it's like you're getting towards the end of the story. It's like, I hope there's a point. What was this all for?
Yeah.
Oh well, masterful. It's like the finale of Knives Out again, but it's happening in front of me.
Oh. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing all
guys.
your
Yeah,
knowledge and
fun.
expertise. Do you have anything to plug before we head out?
Oh, not really.
Okay. Where can people find you?
Movies. I'm on Instagram at CMAC106.
I will say, Colin, you and I have worked together a few times. There are some shorts that we made with our good friend Brian Andrews that you can see online. You can see plenty of examples of Colin's work there, and you can also see me doing goofy bullshit. And I'm sure there are places where people can pull up examples of your work, right?
Yeah, I have a website. It's colinpmcdonald.com. It's a little bit older. I haven't updated in a while, but
You go check out his business over there, or just hang out around the Panavision building.
That's right.
Until Colin walks to his car.
Yeah.
That's right.
But don't follow him to his car. Keep your distance. You don't know him.
That's right. You don't know what I might do.
But if you want to follow Lex to his car, you have to start on social media. Where can they find you?
Yeah, I guess you could try and bait me into revealing my location on Twitter or Instagram at @TheLexMichael.
Nice. And you can stay away from me, but live at a distance on Twitter at TariJ, TariJay. But most importantly, you can find this podcast on Twitter at Missing Outcast. That's MissingOutcast. Once again, I'd like to thank you, Colin, for joining us. This has been a really fun conversation. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. So make sure to follow Colin, make sure to follow us, and make sure to have a wonderful holiday. We're in the midst of Hanukkah. Today, as of this launch, is Christmas Eve. So if you celebrate that, have a great Christmas Eve. And if you are all about that Kwanzaa shit, yo, we start in a couple days. Let's light some candles, my dude. But until then, this has been the retrospective that's introspective.
And now you have a new perspective that 15 years from now, we're going to come back and clutter up with a bunch of CG dewbacks.
Hell yeah. McClunky!